Well, the crime statistics that came out of Gauteng yesterday show that at least 61 children were murdered in Gauteng in the first 3 months of the year. And there's so much violence in our society involving children. It seems, or perhaps we are, that we're trapped in a cycle of violence. Children see violence around them, they feel the violence around them, and then maybe some of them act on that violence when they are adults. Dr Melanie Moon is a senior lecturer in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Stellenbosch. Dr Moon, good afternoon to you. When we see so much violence, I mean, children must see their parents being fearful, scared of crime. They must see instances of violence. What does that do to young children?
Yes, I think one of our biggest problems is that, as you said, that children are exposed to violence in the home as well as in the communities. So we definitely see a very strong link with children who has been exposed to violence. The long-term psychological problems are really apparent. Especially we see there's a very a big link between child-to-parent violence later on, earlier pregnancies, as well as several psychological problems that are actually linked to exposure to violence from a young age. We also talk about that first 1,000 years, of a child's life that is so critical for development. And if that's also part of adversities and exposure to violence, that can be detrimental on the long term.
If children see violence or even experience it in their homes, does that make it more likely that they'll engage in violence themselves when they get a bit older, maybe when they become a teenager or even as an adult?
Yes, most definitely. Like I just said, we sort of see it as a cycle of violence. So we sort of also call it a culture of violence in South Africa. So unfortunately, most children see that the problems are solved by being violent. So we're trying to move away from that because we also see that that's very negative for brain development. For instance, if a child is also punished physically at home or just sees violence, we see as an adversity that they're exposed to. And the long-term effects is that they solve their problems by being violent later on, or they start with bullying behavior at school. So, and it's also almost the genesis of it is at home, where they are firstly exposed to it. That's how I solve problems. I don't argue, or I don't try and explain why I'm doing something. I'd rather resort to a violent act. And then that becomes sort of, how do you solve problems? If I have never seen it in any other way being solved, then that would be my way of solving it at school if something doesn't go my way. What is also a little bit worrying now is that children are not even seeing the violence in communities anymore as a problem. It's almost as it's part of their culture. It's almost part of their being, which is very worrying, for a country like ours who's plagued by violence.
How do we then reverse that? And there's, a huge amount of work to do. It involves all of us, not just government. But where do we start with trying to reverse that, to reduce the amount of violence that our children see and experience?
Yes, so we are working very hard on, projects that we want parents to be involved with, for instance. So I think it's important that parents also get guidance from schools and from the government on how to deal with discipline in a more, not with violence, not with giving them a smack or whatever, because we see that that's got detrimental effects. We're also working on compassionate care programs. So we're very much for, if you teach a child empathy, then they will not probably do something else to someone else if I understand where they come from. But like you said, these are programs that we are busy with, but I think we need to work on programs as a collective, as a society, In other words, government, the Department of Education must come in with these programs as part of the schooling system already, in life orientation, life skills, and so forth. But then I think there's really also a case to be made for the family. Parents must also now buy into alternative ways of disciplining my child, or being that example to my child, being there for my child, listening to my child, because I think it's not something that can be solved just by an individual or a small group of people.
It's really interesting to see how schools have changed. So 25, 30 years ago, people who were growing up then had corporal punishment. I mean, literally, grown adults using an implement to discipline a child. I mean, unimaginable now. Now, that doesn't happen anymore, or is not supposed to happen. There's a lot more education for children, how to resolve disputes, as you explain. At the same time, though, it seems, and I mean, this is hard to assess, but it feels that our communities may have become, unfortunately, more violent in the same time. So children are going to school, and schools will probably have less violence. There are incidents, but probably less violence. But that's not the totality. That's not all of their experience.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, the thing is, I don't agree 100% with we have less problems at schools. We actually are the country with the second most violent acts in schools in the world. So unfortunately, like you just said, even though the schools have fantastic programs and we preach these, the right way of doing things, when they do go out and they go back home, they are exposed to that again. So we found in studies that they sort of don't even talk about, the murder that they saw outside a home the other day. They talk about things that are happening at home, and they're often exposed to violent acts by parents and mothers and people that should actually care for them. So our problem is definitely, like, for instance, 25% of the murders are committed by someone that you actually live with in home. So the home is not a safe place. So I think that's part of our problem is we have these programs, but it needs to spill over into our communities and into our families as well, and they have to buy into it. But I think the adversities that people are also exposed to now, like poverty, very high HIV/AIDS that we've got in South Africa, we've got a lot of social problems that we also deal with, and there's a direct link with that as well, and violence, in communities.
I mean, the roots of all of this are very deep in our society. I mean, there are many different elements to it. I would argue that the migrant labor system from first colonization and then apartheid plays a huge role, because basically what that meant was generations of people didn't grow up in families, and the definition of family has changed as a result, and people sometimes are members of 2 or 3 families. Now, sometimes that can work. Sometimes it doesn't, and it leads to more disputes. So the roots of this in our society are incredibly deep. Absolutely.
We're a very complex society, and we are also a very diverse society. And we have definitely moved away from that concept of the nuclear family. We've got a mother and a father and 2 children. Families are just much more dynamic than that. We also see a lot of children being brought up by a grandparent. We also know that grandparents don't always have that energy to necessarily discipline the children or take up that responsibility on their own. It's a big responsibility. And like you said, that where it comes from is too complex to actually explain in one conversation. But even having said that, I think we still do have to try and find solutions for these problems, because it's got a detrimental effect on the whole society, as a general, on our economy and so forth.
So there are certain things that government can control. It can, to an extent, control schools, as you say, not nearly enough. There are many things that can't. You can't. The famous phrase is you can't put a police officer in every home, and that's obviously true. You can teach children. That's what government does. There are other influences as well, though. I mean, there's a lot of violence in sort of TV, streaming services, a lot of violence in computer games, things like that. Do we need to look at that as well, or is that really, considering where we are, just a very small factor, an insignificant factor in what's happening?
No, I'm very much for looking at a holistic picture and not only look at one factor or the other. And we definitely see that by watching, for instance, any television, exasperates or makes it worse, violent acts afterwards. So we see that children, if they watch television, they tend to be violent afterwards. It doesn't have to be even a violent television program that they watch. So, and these days, like you said, children are almost 100% of the time, or not 100%, but a lot of the times they're on their phones, on their computers, on television. So it must have an influence on how they see things and how they do things. And I think we sort of underestimate how important that is, because I think when I grew up, we had television, say for instance, for a period of time, and we were worried about that. And now children are actually linked to the internet 24/7 basically. And parents are also not monitoring that really. So that's also part of the problem. You know, they always have their phones with them when they go to bed, when they wake up. It cannot be good for a child's development, but also not for violent acts.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr Melanie Moon is a senior lecturer in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Stellenbosch. Just the beginning of really such an important conversation. So many different people to hear from.